Is this all set here? Okay. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started. So the topic again tonight is Requirements Development Made Easy, a simple framework for effective process capture. That's kind of a mouthful to start. So we're going to kind of get into some of the terminology. But ultimately, for this group, business analysts, we always want to talk and bring back requirements management into the picture. Because ultimately, if you're in project work or no matter what you do as an analyst, you're managing or deriving or figuring out how to handle some sort of requirements. And if you're not, I'd be interested to see what you're up to. But the agenda, I'm going to go through it quickly, and then I'll kind of expand on the introduction of Cavi Consulting. But I'll talk about who's with you today. We're going to talk what is process. What is process capture? Because capture is a term that it's used sort of, I've seen it used in the market, but it's specific especially to our consultancy, which is process capture. What does that mean? We're going to talk about process storytelling, process visualization. You can tell I love the word process. And process requirements and management. And that's going to really bring it all together. So how is all this process stuff really relevant to requirements management? And then we'll do a quick summary. Generally in this presentation, I like to be very conversational. If you guys have any questions, pause me anytime. Raise your hand, just start coughing into your hand or whatever, and catch my attention, and we'll stop. And we'll answer questions as we go too, in addition to having time for questions at the end of the presentation. So again, Nishant did a great job introducing me, so I'm not going to rehash. You can kind of look at the slide. But ultimately, Cavi Consulting, we started this last year. And the whole point is between Lean and Six Sigma. Is anyone familiar with Lean and Six Sigma methodologies in the room? Raise your hand. Does anyone know this stuff? You use it in business analysis? Yeah, some of you guys. So there's a definite gap in the market about application, right? It's really sound in terms of the logic, the DMAIC model, and how you do lean process improvement. But what they glaze over a lot of the time is the process mapping. They say you need to do it. You need to understand the process before you move forward. But how? A lot of process mapping methodologies are not very prescriptive. So that's really where Cavi Consulting was formed, which is really to say, this is how you should process map. But before process mapping is really capturing and structuring process information, because that's where a lot of business analysts struggle. You could be brand new on a project and they say, go into this room and figure out what they're doing and build me some maps. You have blank pages, lots of shapes, but you don't really have any guidance about how to structure that information, how to pull it from people. So that's really what this consultancy, Cavi Consultancy, is about. It's to talk about how do we structure process information so that we can effectively communicate it, not only to ourselves, but to a wide audience. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Because if you can get the process on paper properly, if you can communicate your process, you're going to have a real easy time managing requirements. And that's really what this whole presentation is about. So with anything that we do, I always like to spend a few seconds or minutes rather on what is process, because that word gets thrown around a lot. So I'll give you my definition of process at a very high level, just so we can level set what we're talking about. This is the common, kind of if you look on Google or if you just have an intuitive sense, you know, you have inputs and it goes through process and then outputs are created. That's really what process is. So you could have raw inputs, you could have ideas, and they turn into goods and services on the way out. But we get kind of stuck in our business mindset a lot of the time, which is, what is your process? We think heavy corporate processes, but really there's a lot of different kinds of processes, right? So when I talk about this slide, kind of get your mind simpler ones, preparing breakfast, developing a budget, cleaning your room. These are all examples of process. And when you look at the study of process or what we're talking about and where you can actually add structured methods to capturing or working with process, it really applies to a lot of things. So I'm going to bring us up to a more general definition of what a process is. A process is anything that takes energy, and that's very broad. It could be any kind of energy in the world, and transforms it into value. And of course, when we talk about value in the business context, we're talking about the difference between benefits and cost. And this is going to be really important. And this is a really rich topic. So I'm just kind of put the seed in your head, and we're going to kind of go that way so you expand a little. The whole point is everything is process. So what you're going to learn tonight about managing requirements, managing process information to help with requirements, this applies to anything and everything. Tying your shoes, getting out of bed, brushing your teeth. You put energy into stuff and you're trying to get stuff out of it. Anything that happens in between is process. So if it's moving, it's a process. Again, just to kind of get your head in the right place, enabled processes can be large and take many hours or days, or simple and take seconds. They can happen one time, Like in a project, you can consider that one big one-time deal, or they could happen multiple times every day by design, such as an operation. If you're manufacturing goods or you're manufacturing services, you could say. Manufacturing is not the right word. If you're producing services every day, you're running the process over and over. So that's what process is. So expand your mind. Think about everything could be a process. And now we're going to learn how to capture everything. So process capture, extracting process information using a consistent method. If you could sum up Cavi Consulting in one phrase, that's it. How do we capture information consistently and visualize it consistently? How many of you in the room have done process maps? Yep, pretty much everyone, right? It's part of business analysis. How many of you would say that if you drew a map today, it would look the same as the map next to you that somebody else drew? Anybody? Is this a problem for business analysts? Yeah, I see some head shaking. We all know this problem. I started in business analysis. I've been doing this for about maybe 8 or 9 years now. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest things that struck me is I would spend hours building a really beautiful map, lots of colors and lots of shapes and conventions, and then nobody could read it because nobody else is drawing their maps that way. And you know what value it has when that's the case? It has zero value, none. If you can't capture the information and visualize it or explain it consistently between your peers, between your project stakeholders, there's not a lot of value there. And it really all comes to this first step, which is how are you structuring the information so that you can visualize it in a consistent manner? So I kind of just started it, but really what you need to know about process capture is you're taking a snapshot. This isn't process definition or defined process at this stage. You're capturing something that's already happening in the environment. And it also kind of refers collectively to the methods used to properly retrieve and store that information from your observation for structured use in the future. But again, one of the bigger takeaways is, as a business analyst, it's easy to go in and try to flex your muscles and say, I know what's happening here, you can make assumptions, or you can read documentation. But that's really not our role as business analysts at this stage. When we talk about capturing process information, you go to the place where it's happening, and you just have to accurately structure that information. You don't have to add anything to it. In fact, I always tell people, if you know how to capture process information effectively, you should need no subject matter expertise. You don't need any knowledge at all. In fact, I tell that people all the time, I don't know anything. They say, what do you know about whatever? I'm in this industry, I'm in this industry. I don't know a single thing about this. I know how to lead this conversation. I know how to capture this information in a structured way from you, and you just go from there. Oop. So I don't know, this is kind of from Six Sigma. This is all over the place, so maybe some of you have seen this, but it's always good to remind us that what you think it is when you go in is going to be very different from what it actually is and what it should be. A lot of times as business analysts, you're kind of given the what it should be up front, what your boss or what the director says, well, we're putting in this solution or you're going to make it look like this eventually. So you're already kind of tilted when you go into these meetings. And then you also have your own assumptions that we have to kind of manage. What you think it is usually some form of clean because we always underestimate business dysfunction. As business analysts, I'm sure you've seen this a lot, so you go in and you can't believe how incredibly messy these folks are doing stuff. Like if I actually had to put every box on the page as accurately as possible, it would be disgusting because they're doing a lot of extra stuff. It's almost sickening, right? You get in there and you just say, there's so much waste here, I don't even know how I'm going to draw this. But you have to. That's the point. If you clean it up, if you go in and think, it can look like this, or I can at least sell it like this, you're not capturing all the improvement opportunity there is in a particular business. So you're already missing it as a business analyst. So what it actually is the subject of process capture. In all its glory, it's going to have a lot of following up. It's going to have a lot of variation. But that's what you have to capture. And you have to have a structured mind and method so you don't get lost when you're doing these things. So I'm going to give in this presentation, I've tried to make this a very practical presentation, so I'm going to start giving you guys some guidance on how you might actually start doing this, especially from experience, but also just in terms of what works. So if you're actually going to have one of these meetings, what does it mean when I say capture meeting? You're going to be interviewing folks typically. And as business analysts, we do this all the time. You're going to go to the point, do the Gemba walk, if you guys know Lean, go to the place where the value is actually happening, where it's actually being done. Or sometimes when you're good at it, you can do it over the phone. But you're going to get in there and you're going to talk to people. It's through conversation. That's the art of business analysis. And what you're going to do is you're going to get the as is. You're going to figure out what the currently existing process is, and that's what you need so you can design the to be. Or like I said, if it's given to you, which is a bad egg sometimes, but then you can still track. You got to know where you're at to know where you're going. So before engaging for these sessions, here's your checklist. You should ask for the existing documentation. I know it's garbage. You know it's garbage. You know it's out of date and it doesn't make any sense, but ask for it anyway, just to do your due diligence, because they're going to ask you if you asked for it. They're going to ask if you read it. And I always get it and I always read it. And I might learn a thing or two. It's good to maybe get some terminology or some stuff that's evergreen, I call it. You know, it's objective. It's not going to change over time. But generally, no one understands how to capture their own process. So I'm with you already. I see some head nodding. We all know what I'm talking about. Oh, what's your process documentation? You're going to scrap it and you're going to redo the whole thing anyway, but get it so you know what's going on. Understand the scope of the expertise of the subject matter experts. This is another important one, and you get dinged for this all the time. If you go to the meeting and you know that there's 5 managers coming and there's no ground level staff or no line level staff, you already done wrong. You got to know who's coming and ask for people. I usually say, give me a manager and give me somebody who started in the last 6 months. Or give me somebody senior and give me somebody who's been doing it on the ground, the admin or the level 1 guy who's been there for the last few years. You got to mix it up a little bit. In terms of capture, if you get one viewpoint, your capture is incomplete. If you got one guy standing and looking at an object from one angle, he's going to tell you what he sees, but you need to get subject matter expertise in the room so you can get the full picture. So this is important in your pre-meeting checklist. Make sure you know who's there and plan appropriately. And then have a clear purpose, prepare questions, and provide an agenda. This is basic business analyst stuff, but as far as a checklist, I want to throw it in here. It's always the same. The agenda is you're going to come in here. I'm going to talk to you about what you do, and I'm going to capture it. That's it. But letting them know is always good to kind of lay the groundwork. This one here is an important one that a lot of business analysts sometimes miss. You've got a laser target when you go to these meetings a lot of the time to say, I'm going to capture this particular technology use or this particular part of the process, but you have to know the context. You have to know the forest before you study the trees. And what I mean by that is, when you start mapping process a lot, as you should as business analyst, unless you know the flow, unless you know the processes that exist around it, unless you have some basic high-level context, you're not getting the whole picture and you can't do analysis properly. So I've given you the list that I think is kind of the perfect high-level 4 questions that you sort of just ask and start a narrative. This will take sometimes 10, 20 minutes out of your first hour or 2-hour session. But I'm telling you, unless you get the universe down, nothing is really going to make any sense to you. You can get it and you can show that, oh, hey, I captured this and here's the map and I give it to your boss, but you're not going to really know the business process. And that's what we want to know so we can do good requirements. So the first one is size of business. Ask for it by revenue or volume or whatever is getting through the process. But ideally here for analyst folks, you're looking for flow. You're looking for how is this process used? Is it used once a day? Is it used 10 times a day? Is it used 100 times a day? To what extent you can start attaching numbers to it is going to help you. So when I say revenue, how much does this cost when it comes through here? When a unit comes through, how many times is it happening? How much are we selling this for? Those kind of things. Always ask about that. And line employees usually know. They'll know this stuff. Number of employees in org chart. Does one person do this process? Do 100 people do this process? If you don't have this context, you can't tell the story. This is all about storytelling. We're going to talk about this in a minute. But if you want to be good business analysts, you have to be good storytellers first and foremost, because we're communicators. We sit between IT, in the business, or we sit between subject matter expertise and other types of resources, stakeholders, third parties. You are communicators. You are storytellers. If you can't tell the story or understand the context in which these processes exist, you're going to have a hard time being a good business analyst. So understand who's doing it. How many people are doing it? Do we have 15 new people? Do we have 30 people with 10 years of tenure? These types of variables impact how the process evolved, how the process will function. Seasonal business patterns of note. This is one that a lot of people miss too, and they're always say, why do you ask for this? You could capture the process today, and they're in their high season. And then next week, the process doesn't work this way because it's completely different month to month, or it's completely different at the beginning of the month, at the end of the month. This is your checklist. So it may not make sense right off the bat, but I see if you ask this stuff, a few times you're going to see they're going to say, oh, actually, we're only like this between these months and these months. You got to know this stuff. You got to know this stuff. If you're designing technology and you design it for 3 months out of the year, did you do requirements management correctly? Probably not. Because how is IT going to know this unless you guys get it? So it's a simple question. Does this happen all year round? Does this happen every few years? What are we looking at here at a high level? And then ask about the high-level narrative, about the business strategy and the evolution. how this impacts the process in general. What are we trying to do here? Is this process revamping tomorrow? Are we having a new vendor come in? Kind of just get a sense of where we are in time. So this is your high-level checklist. This is how you want to start every meeting, no matter what. Well, unless it's like a second or third meeting with the same subject matter experts. But typically, if you're going in to understand requirements or understand a process, this is where you have to start. You have to really understand what is going on in the business. And the guidelines are fairly intuitive, and you probably do this a lot already, which is take notes on paper or whiteboard form. If you're in there trying to map on your computer or you're fooling around on your computer in general, you're not engaged in the conversation. I always, to this day, my staff complains to me all the time because I can't write. That's my problem. So they're taking my notes, but I'm a terrible I can't write. I'm like Dr. Scroll. But get on a board, get on paper even. If there's no board, I'm the guy who I'll come up with no computer. I'll go across all over the world, and I travel light. And I'll have no computer, and they'll say, what are you doing? And I'll grab some butcher paper. I'll say, what's the biggest paper you have in this office? Sometimes I'll just even rate it out of the printer, like a legal size sheet. And I'll go in and I'll draw, and that's it. I'll do that all day long. Don't feel like you have to be behind a computer to be a good business analyst, because at this stage, when you're trying to understand what's going on, drawing and being able to move and write notes is where you want to be. So always think paper, whiteboard when you're starting these conversations on process. And if you have the luxury, I know we're all overhead, right? So costs are kind of tight these days. But have a second person in the room, especially if you're kind of new at this sort of thing. They can keep your parking lot. They can be filling out requirements sometimes on your matrix, on the computer while you're leading conversation. They can be taking extra notes, and they can generally keep you on track. So I always say, and if your boss says, well, Sam told me that I need a second person in the room, they'll say, who is that? But anyway, say like the experts say you need a second person in the room. It's critical. Even when you're a master of this kind of stuff, doing requirements meetings and requirements gathering and process requirements type stuff, it's tough on your own. There's a lot of different layers going on, and you guys probably know what I'm talking about. When you're managing stakeholder conversations, you have to be competent, you have to be confident in leading where you're going with the conversation, you have to be capturing stuff on paper, like getting the information. You're wearing multiple hats at one time, so don't boil the ocean and think you're an incompetent analyst if this is tough. This is tough. This is tough stuff. This is like expert consulting type stuff doing these meetings. And that's it. So then really what we talk about with storytelling, and we're about to into this whole section, how do you run these meetings? What is the capture technique? It's simple stuff. It's the 5 W's. You probably learned it in grammar school about writing articles. We're bringing things back to the physical space. I'm not reinventing anything new with my company or with what I do. It's back to the basics done consistently and done well. So what is the 5 W's? What happened? Who was involved? Where did it take place? When did it take place? And why did that happen? That's your 5 W's of good journalism. So why am I talking about journalism in the context of requirements management or process capture? Because this is storytelling. This is how people tell stories. This is how you understand something. This is when you read the newspaper, it's not like reading a tech spec. It's not like reading a tech doc. You read it and you understand what's happening because it's got good storytelling behind it. And we're going to be doing the same thing. But when we talk about doing it for process, it's a little bit different. What action step happened or is being observed? What's going on in the room right now? If you're observing the process happening directly, or if you're just having an interview with somebody, what is it they're doing? That's the what. The who is which job role was involved. I don't care if it's Bob or Nancy or Sally. I need to know the role. I need to know the org chart role. I need to know what function they're supposed to be playing. That's the who. It's the function. Because later we're going to see functions can be done by machines or done by people, but it's the who done it. Who is the one doing the action? The where. This is not where in the world are we. It's where is the action happening? So this might be a little bit different in terms of how you were thinking about it, but what's the system, the tool, or the space where this happens? I can't tell you how many times that we write process maps, and I know a lot of you raise your hand, so you might be thinking I might be a culprit of this. You write these boxes, and it says, this is done by this person. Is it done on paper? Is it done in Microsoft Excel? Well, I don't have any, I can read this and like, oh, this is done, but the where it's done, the system or the tool that it's done in, it adds that context, adds that color. It's almost useless to me if I don't have all the pieces. I can't tell what's happening here. I can't imagine myself doing this process unless I have that level of context. So where did the action take place? The when is fairly intuitive. We all know about kind of connecting boxes with lines. What's the sequence? When did this happen, this action happen compared to other actions? So that's your when. And then the why did that step happen? This is where you put on your analyst hat. And this may be less important in the capturing the information, but more important for you to know during the meetings, why are we doing it this way? And we've all heard the same reasons that, oh, I was told to do it this way, or we've always done it this way. But why is this happening? Why does this happen like this? That's a real big part of the analysis part of why this is going on. Why are we in the room, basically? So that's sort of the 5W model, a little bit tweaked for process information. And again, what is process information? It's everything. That's everything you're going to be looking at. So these slides are in the deck for your reference. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I kind of just rambled on here in person with you about what each is. But for the what, again, don't presume to understand the process. Just figure out where you're starting and where you're ending and say, what happens next? What happens next? What is being done? So it's kind of, you just got to get in there and keep to your scope. And that's where your second person in the room will help you. If you start wandering off on just digressing on random topics of interest, they'll say like, hey, scope. Keep it in scope, right? And go from end to end. The who, like I talked about the system, the who is the same. If you don't get the role, I do swim lanes in the CAVI mapping language. So we're going to talk about that. I'm sure not everyone's a stranger to swim lanes. But the who is a big one. You got to know who's doing it. It's just as bad as not knowing how they're doing it or what system they're doing it in. If you don't know that, you don't have anything. The where, we already kind of beat this to death. The one thing I would say is, even if it's on paper or Excel, in the physical world, the 5 W's are always there. You might think system, oh, they're using the core transformation system, they're using the ERP, they're using CRM. Sometimes the system is a pencil, sometimes it's a phone. But rarely do people just sit there and do something and they don't use something to do it. So you can always assume that the where is going to be there. So don't forget, paper is a system, Excel is a system, Word is a system. We're here in the Microsoft building. It's kind of so common we don't even think of it as like these are systems, but those are heavy-duty systems. The Microsoft suite, and make sure you let me know if I'm reading your process map. They're filling in this template or they're sending this letter. Where are they doing that? In Word, or they're doing it on paper. That's a big difference in the process. So make sure that this is in here. When, the one thing I'll say about when is, in the physical space, so for you guys who know process mapping, I'm going to make this real simple today on the process mapping when we get there, because storytelling is simple. But in real life, there's only two kinds of timing that can happen, and that's linear or decision trees or forks. Things happen in sequence in real life. Maybe in computer land, they happen in parallel, and they can happen like multiple times simultaneously. But in real life, where we're going to be mapping, things happen linearly, or you just have decisions where they fork, and that's it. That's the only kind of sequencing that you really need to know. And again, another point on the when is, when you're asking, if you fully understand when things are happening in relation to other things, that's how you're going to really be able to put it in. Don't let this distract you, because you could ask why on every step when you're doing these kind of meetings, and they're going to tell you crap that's going to make your head spin. And you could spend hours talking about, well, what did you just say why we're doing that? And why is that happening that way? And it's crazy. It's just complete craziness all the time. So don't get sucked in by these sidebars on how crazy these processes are, because you're never going to finish. Just don't even bother. So, but you need to know, it's a lot of times I feel like I'm kind of, corporate therapy is what people tell me. I ask why and they tell me and I don't judge it. It's like, okay, that sounds good. I'm gonna write it down, move on to the next part of the sequence. So again, and I wrote that there, don't let weak, inconsistent, or convoluted process elements, and that's kind of me saying it the nice way, nicer than I just said it. Don't let them sidetrack you. Remember to stick with your scope. We're gonna get to the why later when you do analysis. And then the general guidelines here. And this is, again, like I told you, the general guidelines of starting these missions. I'm giving you all my secret tips and strategies for going into these meetings. Make sure to ask about all possible outcomes. A lot of people miss this. Again, you're so excited and you say, oh, I got it from end to end, and we know what's going on, right? But then you don't ask, is this how it happens every time? Oh, that's for the next one, sorry. So for this one, the outcomes one is, if people say, they usually give you the happy path. Have people heard of that phrase, the happy path? Yeah. So when you're a business analyst, everything is always you get the best story first. They want to tell you how this works correctly. But if they say we review it, or we approve it, or we clear it, you have to ask for the other outcomes, which is, well, what if it didn't clear? What if it didn't get approved? What if the review went badly? They don't tend to tell you that unless you pull it out of them. So make sure that you're looking for the decision trees. You're looking for those diamond shapes as you're talking to them. And then what I was starting was I got confused. The confirm this is the only way it's done. A lot of times you got the star player or you have the weakest player. It's usually one or the other. It's not a lot of times they give you the guys in the middle of the road unless they're the only people with free time. So you got to be careful that say, is this the only way it's done? Especially if the process you're looking at is done by 50 people and you got 2 in the room. Hey, is this the way you do it or is this the way the other people do it? So you want to make sure that it's performed this way or there's no alternate processes you're missing. And then be conversational. At the end of one of these sessions, you guys know how draining it is. You get to the end, you're like, oh, great, thanks, and then you leave. Ask them if they have anything to share with you. Make this a consulting level conversation when you do your business analysis, which is, how do you feel about this process? Are you happy? I'll ask people these things. Do you like doing this day in and day out? Is there anything you want to tell me that I may have missed? Engage them and open it up and let them just tell you the requirements. A lot of times as a business analyst, we go in there with our tools and we're on our spreadsheets and we just want to fill in the boxes. But make it conversational. Don't forget that these folks are the subject matter experts. You are an expert in soliciting information from them, but they know what's going on and they know how bad these processes are. And that's the reality of business today, which is these processes are garbage. And you go in there and if you ask them, hey, is this garbage? 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you emphatically, yes, this is bad. I do this because I have to, but I hate this. And I'm like, how much do you hate it? Where do you hate it more than others? I'll ask people things like, what makes you dread coming to work? And they'll tell me. That's capturing business requirements. So don't forget, this is important. So how does this look in practice? Well, here's the CAVI method in a simple visual. You've got your 5 W's, and I've kind of put them on the simple process map, but this isn't far off from what your process map should look like if you're telling the story in an intuitive way. You've got what is going on in your boxes. You've got who's doing it in the swim lane. I do left to right. You do where. This is where I put it in brackets right at the top of the process step. You know, it seems fairly simple and intuitive once you start reading it that way, but generally this is missed. People are always trying to put the system, I don't know where they put it. Sometimes it's not even there. Just put it right at the top. I've had people who read these maps, they don't know any experience, they don't have any business analysis experience, they don't know anything, and they're like, oh, okay, so here's obviously what the tool is, and then the step is right under it. It just connects it, so you want to make sure you do that. And then the when is the sequencing, and the why is, you can write that in the margins. It's not really as relevant in the visualization, but equally important to capture. And that's the capture strategy. 5 W's, and you could go into a room right now with anybody and when you start practicing this, and my team at the consulting company and all my other companies, you start thinking like this. Because this is how humans think. And that's what we're going to talk about when we get into storytelling. But it's sort of the intuitive sense of, okay, well, you told me how it's happening. Now tell me where it's happening and when it's happening and why it's happening. And you just go and you just become an investigator. And that's good requirements gathering, right? So process storytelling, why are we doing it this way? Why is this a communication objective? The whole point is, if you're going to improve or control a business process, you got to manage it, and managing it is communicating it. That's all. It's the primary objective to any of the work we do. So this, you can look at this slide for reference later. I'm not going to stay long because we already kind of talked about this. But if you're going to organize, package, or understand and communicate processes, you got to have a good form of visualization. This is your first level of requirements gathering. And we're talking about how process requirements is kind of a misnomer. But if you think about it, this is it. This is the first stage, the foundation of requirements gathering, which is how are you going to communicate what is out there, what is going on. And as always, this probably resonates with a lot of us in the room. You got to make one document, but you got to make it for this list of people. You got a lot of people here. You got a diverse audience, and that's complicated because they all speak different languages to some extent. Operations people, subject matter experts, us, process people. We're the most annoying sometimes, process people. Technical and IT people, project people, executive people, audit and compliance people. That's when you know you're in trouble, right? When you got audit and compliance people in there asking you questions. And you got third-party event people and vendors. How do you do this? Well, there's got to be a common ground, and there is. And your storytelling should address that common ground. So what it is what we've been talking about. We're people. We're all people. That's our common ground. How do people communicate? How do people think and talk? We're tactile in nature. We're very physically oriented. We use our senses, and we all have the same ones. This is a very important point in business analysis and general communication and storytelling, because we don't have to make up a complicated language of shapes and conventions and colors and tools, because we all have the same senses. We all think about things the same way in the physical world. And processes should be visualized and communicated in that way so that anyone can imagine themselves seamlessly executing everything that's being done on paper from start to finish. So think about it for a minute. Even if you're in highly technical processes or highly system-driven processes, somebody has to read this and know what is going on. Everything has to be linked together in the physical space, or no one's going to be able to understand it, and your documents are useless. And you have to tell yourself that. I was a business analyst in the pits with no guidance many years ago, and I remember the frustration of spending hours and hours and hours making garbage. And we all know that as business analysts. People say, this is great work, you check the box, thank you. But process maps are often not read, and they're often thrown out. And that's a problem. You don't want to be in that position because that's a waste of your time. So as we move forward, I mentioned systems, but in this last bullet, there's 2 points of view. There's the physical point of view, which we all know and love, and we understand. And then there's the non-physical point of view, which is which tables are being queried, which algorithms are being called, which databases are being pulled from. That stuff is important, but we got to separate it. You can't mash that all together into these process visuals. And also, you don't want to mash them all together in your requirements documentation either, because nobody understands that. We need to keep the physical and the non-physical separated. And we're going to talk about how we do that. So a little more on that point. The physical drivers of process are the things that people can see and do. And this is the business point of view, what I'll call the business point of view, the physical point of view. And this is where we need to be mapping, because this is what people get. The non-physical drivers of a process, and a driver of a process is anything that moves a process from end to end. Because you've got boxes on a page, and it's going to progress through its life cycle, but things drive the process forward. Sometimes it's the system, and that's the system point of view when there's things happening that you can't see. But every process involves a mix of both. And the thing that's making our jobs harder is this continuum that I built very simply, which is processes are becoming more automated over time. So we exist always somewhere on this continuum where it could be 100% people-driven or 100% system-driven or automated, and it's always going to be a mix. So you've got elements of both stories happening simultaneously in the business environment, and this is tricky for people to get their heads wrapped around. But you can start by knowing what it is so we can separate these things. But it's getting harder because we're moving that way. We're trying to automate more, so things are becoming more physically disjointed, and you've got people doing physical stuff and non-physical stuff, and they're all mixed together. So we have to be careful in how we separate and visualize these things. We're focusing only on the business process. So again, and this is kind of talking points of what I just talked to, it becomes less intuitive the more system stuff is happening. And especially if you put it into your requirements or your maps and you don't separate it properly, it becomes even less intuitive for people. But the fundamentals of storytelling in the physical sense are captured in the 5W model that we already went over. And that's the punchline of this. If you want to stick to the physical, stick to the 5W capture method that we talked about. Because you can't go wrong if you ask all those things and you have them all for each step, because then they're going to tell you the information in a physical way. So you don't have to filter all that stuff out or kind of worry so much about the system behavior as such. So here's a bit of a visual example for you on how a process map might look if you've got this system stuff separated out correctly. Look at the wrong sense here. So in Outlook, you can see I've got the where identified at the top. We send an email to the manager, and Outlook automatically sends duplicate email to the assistant. This may seem intuitive. This may seem like it makes sense. But in reality, when you have a full map like this is where things get ugly, because we actually don't see Outlook automatically doing stuff or sending duplicate emails. And already we don't see, in a process sense, see the other role getting that email at that same point in time, unless you map that path too. So you're bringing in confusing elements into the physical story. So if I'm a person reading this, I see, okay, I'm sending something to my manager, but now there's another email being kicked off somewhere else to somebody else, and my attention is moved. Even using that same information and calling it out, and I'm going to tell you how I prefer to do this in more detail, but the step in the physical space is, in Outlook, I'm sending an email to my manager. That's the process step. Outlook automatically sends duplicate email, same thing, but it's called out. It's separated. So this may seem minor at this point, but in larger maps or when you're talking about separating this information, this is the key to telling the story correctly, because my mind automatically puts this in a different category. This is context now. This is not in the box. Stuff in the box is critical, but the context stuff is something I need to know, but it's not necessarily part of the process story. And again, I'm not telling you guys, because a lot of business analysts, we work in system implementation, we work in software development. It's not we can ignore this stuff. We just have to make sure we know what it is and separate it properly. For very complex system-driven behavior, you can map that separately. There's different layers and different things we do so that the people who are interested in system stuff can have it. But you have to realize first that everybody needs to know the business process first. It doesn't matter if you're the most senior developer on the team or the most senior engineer on the project, you will not have a value loss knowing the business process or what the business people are doing first. You have to. So this is never going to be a waste of time. You may have to add on some system behavior later, but this is where you start. So if you look at the entire story, you're going to have a business process. You're going to have a system process, possibly. You can put some system context to keep the links together in the business map, but the system stuff can be separate. And in all honesty, in all the years I've done this work, even in the heaviest software implementation projects, I barely ever have to make that system map over there. By the time I've done the business map and I've separated properly and I've built requirements off of it, the tech people have everything they need. They actually don't need to know how the current system works. Or even, and nobody, the developers, nobody, if you build the system map, I've built them before, developers can build them on their own paper when they're building the design, but the business people can't read that stuff. Who would you ever build that for if you think about it? Nobody. The system people don't even need to know the system behavior now because they already kind of know it. They need to know the business behavior. Nobody needs to know the future system behavior unless you're actually developing it and they do their own thing. I've never had to build this, ever. I could, but chances are you won't have to. So just kind of a point of experience on that. So then we talk about the visualization. So we've already started talking about mapping during capture. We've talked about mapping during process storytelling. But I want to separate this because the storytelling piece is telling you why the maps are going to start looking a certain way or why we visualize a certain way. But now I'm going to give you some guidance, some practical guidance on how to actually visualize or map process information. So assuming that you've gone through and you've captured the 5 W's and you've done your information capture correctly, which is the hard part of business analysis, honestly. That's the hard part. If you get that out of the way, the visualization is putting it on paper, and it's just one at a time. Here's an example map of a services company, and I've titled this sort of dramatically, 3 Shapes, Infinite Complexity. But it's true. I'm going to tell you that the language we use, and I've used this across many different sectors, I only use that terminal, that oval shape, and that square, and that diamond, and that's it. That's how you tell stories. I don't need BPMN's 1,000 shapes and conventions and email boxes and bubbles and colors, and that stuff's nonsense. And I'll tell you my opinion on that. I think a lot of it is so that process people can keep everything to themselves, so it's really hard to learn and no one can do this stuff, and then you have to pay for certification courses and things like that. That's my assumption. But in general, this is the easy stuff, right? It's 3 shapes and that's it, and then you tell the story with it, and you just do it consistently. If I told you all now everyone go out and map, you only get these 3 shapes and you have to do swim lanes like this, and it's a few simple rules, now all your stuff's going to start looking more together. So on this, the red callouts are kind of just showing the proper use of shapes. Here you've got a swim lane, you've got a connector, you've got a diamond for a decision, you've got squares, and you've got ovals. I mean, I don't need to beat it to death. That's really it. It's the secret sauce. It's just simple. Simple is better. And then again, line callouts to kind of show some system behavior if you have to. So let's look at this for a second. So here, if you can't see in the back, all this says is they've got a ticketing process here, and it says close the ticket. So then the next step says receive an email in the client inbox. So there's a misfire here in the physical story, because if I say I'm closing a ticket, that doesn't say send an email, but this guy receives an email. So what I've done is you put the system behavior here as context so that people understand when the ticket is closed, an email is automatically sent. Because somebody is not triggering that email, and if you don't have it done like that, you could put it in the box like we had it before, but then everything gets muddy. You need to make sure that the sequencing makes sense in the physical environment, and that's where you use kind of extra context, extra stuff. So here's the secret strategy in visualization. Again, you've got a workflow action or step. Lead with a verb, have a noun. I mean, stuff you guys have probably seen. It's pretty simple, but just keep it simple. It's just doing the good stuff right. And the only real trick here is the brackets. And I guarantee, like I said, if you start doing this tomorrow in your current companies or context, people will get it. You don't have to explain it. You don't need a key. Just put the system or where it's happening right up front, right on top of the box with what's happening under it. Boom, you've changed the game. Isn't that crazy? Who does that, though? I don't see anyone doing that. They put it in all sorts of weird places, the systems and where it's happening. But that's it. So that's that step in the CAVI mapping method. This one, not much to say about it. We kind of know this shape. It's a diamond. It's standard language. We're not trying to change the game with that. You put questions in it. And the questions, depending on the answer, moves you in different directions. That's it. And then this one, I think this is really important visually, but actually this works the exact same way as the square. You got a where, it's just a process step. You don't waste time putting start or stop in it. That's just extra space on the page, and why would we do that? That doesn't make any sense. But it does tell you that, hey, this is the start of a process stream, or this is the end of a process stream. So you make it a little bit of a different shape, but the content is the same. It's a step. It could be the first step or the last step. You're always going to have one first step, but if you've got diamonds, you could have multiple other steps. But I just call this shape terminal. It's a process terminal. That's all it is. You've got squares and you've got terminals. Boom, done. That's it. That's all the shapes you need. But this part gets a little complex, so I put in a few slides here for your benefit. Visual partitions. So we know that if I had that whiteboard over there and I could write on it all day long, then I could capture any process of any length. But we know that if you're working in Visio, Lucid Charts, Smart Draw, or whatever, there's a number of tools. We have to do things in frames because we can only see things on an 8x11 typically is how most systems are structured. So there is some consideration to how you seam frames together when you're doing process mapping. And that's the visual partitioning element of it. So you can think of it again as like pages of a book or stills in a movie. Like we can only see a certain amount of things at a time, so we have to design to it. So how do we organize process information? Well, how do you organize boxes? You put lines around it automatically every day, which is you've got one step. Step could have an action. Sometimes they have two actions if they're always going to be together. But you do this already. So this square, when you say, okay, here's what I think is intuitively, here's one step. Well, one frame is the same concept. You wouldn't put a bunch of jargled or garbled up like information in half actions or half steps in a box. Why would you do that in a frame? It's the same concept. The frame is just a bigger step. So when you think about framing process maps or framing process, have one discrete action or step per frame. Just like you would when you have a box in a frame. You're going to see in a second, that's what it all is. It should represent a complete thought. Just like a book or a movie, you don't have things cut at weird sequences. It should be intuitive. And how do we control that as a business analyst when you're the one, it's your point of view, it's through detail level. If you think about how detail level works is, well, if I'm saying one box could be a single page, let's look at this higher level versus lower level, some of these examples here that we know. Grooming. This is my get out of bed in the morning routine. So I get out of bed and then I groom myself. If I wanted to know more information on grooming, I would make a whole other frame on brushing my teeth, shaving, showering, etc. And if I wanted to do on brush my teeth, it's the same. If I told you, start doing the brushing teeth process at the level that you want, but I need you to fit it on one page, well, you could boil it up to one box, or you could boil that up. It's all in your control. But the point is, for each frame, just like here, have a complete thought. This will become easier for you when you start filtering your process maps for the business point of view only. That's going to make it more intuitive like it is here, because everyone says, well, this is a real easy one, Sam. This is super easy. I mean, what if I've got all these technical things in there? Make that easy too. Just make it all easy. And the point is then you can more easily go from very fine detail or granular detail to less so, and then you can fit your visual frames to make it consistent, to make it complete thoughts. So this is more of a visual of how that might look when you're associating visual frames across detail layers. So typically in a good process map, the complete thought should be on the first page, and it's usually 5 or 6 boxes. The whole thing. It could be for the executive. It could be sale is going to come in, this is going to happen, we're going to close the sale, and everyone's going to celebrate. But that's the whole thing. And you say, well, that's meaningless. Nobody wants to see that. That's not true, because it's the whole story in one page. It's like your table of contents for a process map. So what value does it have? Well, it frames everything so that an executive or anyone reading it right off the bat knows, here's the whole enchilada right here. This first box, it tells me the entire story. Now, if I want to know more detail about the ordering process or the business development process or the whatever that box is, I can drop into another frame, and this could be a whole other map. But that's how they're organized. That's it. Everything is in detail layers, and there's associated sometimes laterally. So if I have this map here and it relates to this, then I know as a reader automatically, because I've already read this page, well, this is going to go here next, because I already know they're connected right here at this high level. So you're setting context. And in that method, you can do that ad nauseum forever. And it seems easy, right? It's well, that makes sense, but it can be a little tricky when you've got a ton of information and you're cutting it up or you're separating it. But that's it. So you always start at level 1, you go to level 2, you go to level 3, and I know in different process mapping languages they have different names for the levels. I didn't really here. It's just you're going to start at a level 1, and then the next level down is 2 and 3, and you just go based on your intuition. But I will tell you that most business analysis is at the L2 level. Sometimes you'll go to maybe an L3 level, because I'm going to have my first thought on the first page, and then I'm going to have more details. But by the time you get to L3 and below, that's when you're getting into the actual documents or the data fields, and then process maps don't serve you anymore. The process map really serves as the shell, so that somebody who needs to know what's going on can keep everything organized. But I tell people, once you start getting to the point where if this step in the L2 level is click here on this form and submit, by the time you start mapping fields or documents associated with that, you're in Excel now. So this L3 is going to be Excel, or this L4 is going to be Excel. Don't try to force information into the wrong tool, because you lose sequence at that level, and you lose a lot of the power that process maps can provide you. So your requirements method switches over at that time. But that's it. So between those shapes and visual framing, that's our whole method. And it's just practicing doing the simple things right that have consistent results. And I say, is it really that easy? Well, yes and no. So there's a few things we didn't talk about tonight, but you saw them all. Line callouts, swim lanes, connectors. Makes sense. Off-page references is what keeps the visual frames together. And we purposely did this. We use Visio a lot because it's everywhere, but you could do this in any tool. They all have these basic shapes. You could start using this knowledge method in any sort of business analysis you do. And we've done it, and it works. And there are a few other rules and nuance that are going to come when you get into it. How do you take these few conventions and map anything and everything in the physical space? You can do it, and you'll get into some weird timing issues sometimes and things like that. But you know enough now just from this session to go out and try it. And you're going to get these questions, and you can solve them or you can be creative. You can use your creative liberties, but generally this is going to work for everything. So I would say after that, happy visualizing, because this is the biggest part of business requirements management, business analysis. It's right here. It's understanding what's happening out there in the physical space, capturing it, and then being able to communicate it to a wide audience. And then the plug for me, you can go to caviconsulting.com/IIBA based on this talk, and you can get that template that I'm talking about right there. So a lot of what we consolidated tonight in this presentation is on one page, just kind of here's the shapes, here's some general rules, here's some guidelines, and you can take it from there. And that's really it for that. So then we go into the punchline of the night, which is process and requirements management. What is process in terms of requirements management? How does it all fit in with what we know in our current systems? So this slide, I could probably do an MBA course on, just this slide, but we're going to kind of make it simple, which is there's no such thing as a process requirement, not a pure process requirement, because process exists in layers. And this is something that's more unique to Cavi, and we could talk about this a lot, so I'm going to try to make it a little bit simpler. But when you look at stuff in the workflow layer, there's really only business people and the people changes and system or IT changes. So here's business requirements and here's system requirements. Those are the only types of requirements that exist. There's no such thing as a process requirement because process is all design. It's all intent. People changes and people is like what? Well, I could have a requirement that I need less people here. I need these role changed. I need different HR energy, focus different else. This would be like people stuff, change management, these types of requirements, reorganizing an office, moving an office, onshoring, offshoring. And then the ones we're more familiar with, system changes. System changes would include ability to statements, actual requirements for functionality, different types of technical aspects so the system can serve the business to actually fulfill their value proposition or their process. But the point is, process design, the maps that you're making, or the maps that somebody made at some point, is what tells these people and these systems what to do. And that collectively is your operating model. Your operating model is how your process is enabled by people and technology, and how value is created as a result of that combination of factors. But when you're talking about requirements management, you got to understand the process design so that you can clearly articulate the business and the system requirements. So really, this is an exercise in business or system requirements, and I wanted to make that clear because process is thrown around in a very confusing manner in our space. So you have to kind of make this differentiation to do this properly. But again, the confluence of these things happening is value creation. We observe here so we can get down to the process design. When you do an as-is process capture for requirements, you're deriving this layer from observation up here. And then when you make the to-be, you're coming back up, and your requirements are just what needs to change to enable a new design. So we can talk about this in the Q&A, which is coming up in a minute. But this is important to know that business or system requirements, no process requirements. If somebody tells you, write me up a bunch of process requirements, you got to know that you're going to be doing a combination of people or IT changes, that's it. And you should separate them in your documents. You shouldn't even really, as a business analyst, depending on what you're doing, be doing people requirements. It comes up a lot. That's more change management. So try to keep those things out of your swim lane anyway. But it gets mixed up because if you don't separate things, you don't identify, classify them, these things get conflated and it becomes difficult sometimes. So part of this education is to know how to separate these things. So process maps and gap analysis, Lean, Six Sigma, probably all of your BA courses, they tell you build the map. Well, you know that's easier said than done, but if you do it and you do it accurately and correctly, you know that requirements gathering is easy after that. You've got an as-is map, which is crap, as we talked about earlier. You've got a to-be map that either has been approved by your project or your system developers or whatever, and the business approves. The delta is what drops out into your business and system requirements. That's it. You go box by box, and you say, what's different in the future if the as-is is accurate? And then you just fill up your matrices, and then day's done. So when you talk about requirements management and making it easy, the capture, the storytelling, the visualization, the whole meat of the presentation, that's how you make requirements management easy. Because it's as easy as that. If I gave you a perfect as-is process map and an approved design, you could whip out requirements in a day for even very complex projects. That's the reality of the situation. So if you're messing around trying to just go in there and draw them cold onto Excel sheets, you're going to be beating your head against that spreadsheet for weeks, months, years, and then the project's going to fail. And that's reality. That really is. And that's not a condemnation on any of you who have been doing that. That's bad project management when you don't know where you are or where you're going, and they just want Excel sheets full of the actual requirements management process. You can see it's all in how you structure the process information. And this is really a basic intro to that. So let's summarize what we talked about today. Everything in motion is a process. You can capture anything. Go home and capture your laundry, your dinner making processes. You can start improving everything if you can capture it. Use the 5W method. This will help you structure your data for intuitive process storytelling. Use the mapping language I shared with you. At least experiment with it. And you can always come to Cavi if you need more help eventually, when we're less startup-y and more not startup-y. And once you have an as-is and a to-be process design, the requirements management is effectively doing that gap analysis we talked about and tracing everything back to the maps. And that is it. That's what I wanted to share with you guys tonight. So thank you very much for being here. And now I'm open for questions as long as we have time. Thank you. Any questions? That can't all make any sense. Yes.
So, first, that, yeah, perfect. Which enables you to get the process. And you also say, stay away from
Sure. So there's a few points there, and I'll answer the last one first. So when I say avoid the people stuff, pure people or business requirements changes, like staff org or role changes and things like that, unless that's your role as a business analyst to be looking at changing business structure, you don't want to like people are going to tell you a lot of their problems in the business process is because we don't have enough people. We have too many people. We have offices split up in funny ways, or our roles don't make sense, or we're not paid appropriately. It depends on your scope. So as a process improvement person, we have a wider scope than like a business analyst. Like when you do process improvement consulting, you usually make a brief on all those factors combined. But as business analysts, it depends on the project, because a lot of times you go and you capture a lot of that stuff, but you're there to capture IT requirements to help with system development. And you do want to keep those things separate, or at least be aware of them, because those have no place on an IT requirements list. Does that make sense to answer that part of the question? Okay, and then as far as the process mapping part, why do we do as-is process capture? We don't do it to eventually build system requirements. We do it to understand the business. So I want to make that very clear that that's the objective of as-is process capture. And I say that with clarity just because, yes, we will eventually use it for all sorts of things. But if you go in thinking, I'm going to do this meeting as the first step in building system requirements, you're already putting your bias into the capture. The capture session is to fully understand the business process and the context in which it operates. And that's the fundamental step for any sort of analysis that can be done, but it has no purpose other than that. And that's the whole point of taking a photo of it. If we could just go into a room of people working and take a picture and it print out a process map, that's what you want to think about it doing. Unfortunately, that's possible, with current technology and everything else, and that's very complicated. But that's your role in doing that. It has no purpose. It's just to capture and understand what's happening. And that could go a lot of different ways. Yeah.
So that's sort of given with the new processes and for you as a staff process person or at least after they're not going to understand that. So, right? They will answer what they wanted. So you have to do that to understand how to get from existing process.
That's absolutely correct. And there's a few parts of that I want to address too, which is process design. The redesign aspect is a very rich and one of my favorite topics. I was kind of smiling about it. And there's a lot of things you can do. So it's not always going to be given to you. So you see your point. Like a lot of times you're going to have to do that. But a lot of times for business analyst role, either you're configuring a new system or the system is in motion as a project and you're kind of going to the business and understanding what they want. But if you start the conversation at what they want, they don't know what they want. They never know what they want. They don't even know what they're doing now. That's the reality in every project. So the point of as-is capture, it's the majority of the work, and it's an investigation. You can't ever even take them at their word. You got to get in, listen to what they're doing, and understand it, and map it, and have them validate it. Because if you have that down, this is where it gets a lot more scientific. But the as-is capture is actually doing the future business requirements to a large extent, because the value chain of the business is already inherent in the as-is situation. So let me pause there and kind of expand that a little bit. It doesn't matter how crappy it is, and it could be done like 50 times slower than it could be in the future, but somebody's paying for the garbage coming out of that process today. That means the value chain is intact, or we wouldn't be doing business analysis. There'd be no business anyway. So as a job as a business analyst, the as-is capture is the most important part, because what you're actually doing is you're scientifically deriving what the value chain of the business actually is. And no matter what you do in your future design, the value chain will usually remain intact because it's what the customers are paying for. So when you build future state requirements, you're collecting the majority of the information you need in a proper as-is capture. But the business will always push you away and say, I don't care what I'm doing today because it's crappy. I'm going to tell you my dream scenario and you're going to listen to it and then you're going to tell that to IT. But that doesn't make any sense. They don't know what they can't possibly know what they're going to tell IT or what they want to be doing. Half the time, they don't even know what they're delivering as the end output that customers are buying. So it's much more investigative and it's much more complicated than I can answer quickly in a few lines. But generally, yes, what you're saying is correct, which is the as-is capture is I would say the most important part of business analysis, because if you do it properly, you're going to get a lot of value. Either if you're going into design or you're justifying a design path that's already picked for you, you are going to understand the business and what the business needs just from knowing what they're doing now. Does that answer? Question? Okay. There's some other questions in the room? Yes.
Just dovetailing on all this, you mentioned that asking for additional information when you're going through the asset process, confirming what other alternatives might be coming out. Isn't it at that point that they're looking for what their pain points are? Distinguishing, I realize what they are not happy about. As you said, if they're coming out with some value, and somebody's buying that value, and so far you're kind of halfway there. It's a matter of how to get to that value in a better way. I think that's what people are concerned about. Sometimes they're not always interested in improving. They're happy with the crappy methods stuff.
Yeah.
But aren't we looking for those pain points and trying to distinguish what is that information?
Yes. Absolutely. No, that's right. And that's kind of when we talked about in the presentation, what else can you tell me? That's really your pain points. You do want to get the pain points, but it's not because, I'm going to say this very callously, it's not that I'm not a loving person, but we don't care what's painful. That's a judgment. But pain points, it means the process is failing. And what we want to look at is, are those pain points, or is the pain that people are perceiving a manifestation of waste in the underlying process design? But yes, we absolutely do want to capture it, but it's all part of the as-is capture. Because sometimes you can get people to tell you the pain points, but again, this is more the HR stuff, and it's treating symptoms and not root causes. And this is where I say caution again to be careful, because if they say, well, this is painful because this is too slow, or my manager has to look at it several times, and this is annoying, you can say, okay, so let me write this down. One of the requirements is they want less approval layers or something like that, or they want less of this or less of that. But that's treating the symptom. You got to look at how those pain points are tying down to the process, because why is it painful for you to get it approved several times? Is it reducing cycle time? Is it adding cost? Like, what is the actual process pain from a customer standpoint that's happening here, and relating it back to that as-is picture of why did this come about, the evolution piece? Is it because we had a major defect that cost us millions of dollars? So now we're the TSA at airport and we rub everyone down and scrub everything 50 times. It's just having that investigative mindset. But the short answer is absolutely you should capture that stuff, but don't capture it on a human or a symptomatic level. Try to put it into the context of your as-is capture from a process level. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
So as far as, a lot of customers have this big topic. I just fundamentally do think looking at processes from outside inside out is the best way to start. Right.
Sure. So I'm going to give you a very confusing answer that dodges both those options. And you look at it from no one's perspective. So what I mean by that is how I've been kind of comical about it, and I'm sorry if anyone's business people in the room, but we know how business people don't know what they want or what they're doing. Customers also don't know what they want and what they're doing, even less most of the time. They're demanding all sorts of garbage, and we're like, well, I guess we're customer centric, so we're just going to do it. But that's also a terrible thing. So whose hat do I put on when I design process? Nobody's hat. So what I mean by that is, in value chain theory, a value chain exists because there's basically a differential in the market or in the environment that causes some people's benefits to be different. Or like, let's say you have economies of scale, or you build an operation to do something. Well, you can do it for cheaper than somebody else, so they should pay you to do it. That happens naturally, just based on how markets are structured. So when you're a business and you look at your process, and I can get down and understand the value chain that's actually being serviced in the market, I design process on top of that value chain. It doesn't have a perspective, because it's just basically there's energy flowing from one place to another based on the mechanics or the dynamics of a market itself, more so than the customer demanding it or the client or like the internal whatever, the company versus the customer demanding it. So you kind of, as a process person or as an analyst, I would encourage you to take a non-biased viewpoint generally. If somebody says, well, you have to build this process for the company, well, that's not customer-centric, and that doesn't make any sense. And if somebody tells you, you need to be completely customer-centric and build this for the customer also doesn't know what they want or what they're doing, and their market's changing, and they could be part of a very small value chain on their side that if you designed your processes that, you would be making something crazy. So you have to kind of understand why a process exists at all. Because if a process isn't producing value or producing negative value, it will eventually disappear. There's process captures I've done where the process died several years ago. The company's losing profitability and losing revenue, and it's just a matter of time because the value doesn't exist anymore. But it's not somebody's perspective. It's the shifting of markets and conditions that cause processes to be more serviceable or less serviceable. And when you redesign on top of it, it doesn't have anyone's unique needs or perspective in mind. It's how do I enhance energy to value creation? Well, we talk about our first definition of process. How do I increase more energy? How do I increase value creation of this process and reduce my energy? And perspective is irrelevant. So I know that's a rambling sort of answer that doesn't quite hit what you're talking about. Does that help? Because that's a deep topic, and that's like talking about markets, all sorts of different things. So okay, good. I always ask if it's satisfactory. People never tell me it's not, but you can tell me, hey, it's a crap answer. I want something else from you. Well, I'll try again. Yeah.
Saying that the customers don't know exactly what defines that value. So
Are we recording this right here? Yeah, keep going.
I mean, is that part of your role? I mean, I think that part of to make sure the customer, work with the customer, try to understand why. And say, well, is this really making them more than so that's the big topic.
Huge, but actually not a topic of conversation. It's the root of what you should be doing as a business analyst. So what you've said is exactly right. It's that people, when you talk to people, they tend to do what they want to do. They want to do what they're doing more effectively. That doesn't necessarily mean they want to produce value more effectively or produce more value for the company or more value for the market or the world, because it's all the same thing, right? Why do businesses trade stuff? Because there's value produced in the transaction on both sides. It's not somebody losing and somebody winning. The difference in benefits and relative costs create value in transactions. So when you're doing these things, you're absolutely right in the sense is, as is capture from clients and from internal, is to understand deeply the nature of the value chain that's happening here. So when you understand that value creation, then you can enhance it. Your job, I would say my job as a process person is as simple as that slide, which is the ratio of energy in to value out. That's what I'm concerned with. That's my only job and my only mission. And I would say business analysts, it's the same. You build requirements so you can make things better. But what does making things better mean? It's not better for a person or better for a project manager. It's better for the company. It's better for the entire value chain or supply chain that the company exists in. And that takes a deeper level of analysis. But you're exactly right. That's what it is all about, or it should be about. Yes. So that's more of the solution strategy, I think is what you're referring to. Yeah. Yeah, and that could speak to a number of things. So I would say it depends on what the project is, because tactical solutions versus strategic solutions to me would imply that you've got scope issues or you've got things you need to put in or there's transition states you have to be attending to. Typically in the requirements management stage, I guess just take a step back, it's always just as is capture. So you can actually do proper analysis and communicate what's actually happening. Because ultimately, what I find is, if you remember that list of stakeholders, if you can actually show them what is happening and they can all understand it, the madness of it sort of presents itself. You don't have to say, well, like, we'll fix it tactically or strategically over short term and long term. It's kind of, what you're proposing doesn't make any sense anymore, or maybe you can actually see for yourself what's actually going on and we can kind of think about what we're going to do. But let me pause there because I don't know if I'm fully understanding the nature of your question. I mean, to me, you do the project work and there's only usually one solution. It's typically a strategic one. So the tactical thing, maybe I'm not understanding, if you could rephrase. Yeah.
But
so
they have a bigger project. You do like integration. You're merging two companies.
Yeah. No. I get what you're saying, and this is where I'm trying to process it because which is I usually try to tell people to operate in the present. I think that most times if you're working 3 years out into the future, you're forecasting things that aren't going to make any sense, especially the business context changes so quickly. So it's kind of like if your 3-year strategy is merging these two companies, all the projects that will result are happening in the now, and you can start where you are and you can iterate towards a grander goal, I suppose. But I don't really ever get in the business of making like interim solutions to kind of track towards a certain thing. And I'm just struggling to articulate it because I guess in the type of value-based process analysis that I do, the value chain itself is not changing. Like you're not stabbing at like an interim tactical solution. It's kind of, we're going to make this value proposition enhanced and there's a direction to solution and people just sort of move towards it. It's not like you have to feed them stages. I'm struggling to articulate. Does that help at all? We could talk more about that. That's like it might be more to your context. Yeah, because you might have a situation I could help you talk through, but I don't know if I'm getting it at a high level question. Hold on one second. Are we strapped for time or can we answer? Okay. Yeah, certainly.
Again, how do you people to stretch their thinking more? They're very immersed, they're very close to obviously the process of the doing every day.
Yeah.
How do you get them when you're trying to engage these to think about what's possible?
So for me, in that design process, typically I always start with an exercise I call blue sky design, which is take all the constraints out of it. So part of that is understanding and listing constraints. So in terms of actually doing the exercise, which is, let's talk about all the constraints on designing a process that you think there are. Like there's regulation or there's governmental constraints, external constraints, there's technology, there's time, it has to be done in 6 months. There's people constraints, like we don't have the right skills. Like list them all out and get everyone to kind of align on what blocking they're thinking, and then have a dedicated hour or so to say, strip all that out, have fun with it. Magic wand sessions, talk about, because this is as much change management as anything else, but they'll know, okay, because a lot of times they're crabby and like, well, we have all these barriers and these things, we can't do that. But if you just say the exercise is a thinking exercise, strip those constraints out, redesign it, and we'll just do whatever you want. And then you can add the constraints back in, because you're going to find a lot of interesting stuff come out of a session like that, where they say, well, if I could wave my magic wand, this would go this way, this would go that way, we'd have a system that could do this, this, and this. They'll build you the blueprint and have fun doing it, but then putting the constraints back on is getting more towards a realistic design. But that's typically how I run those sessions. If you've got a workshop, if you've got a day or 2 days, it's worth spending the first 2 hours and first 30 minutes of that talking strictly, what is a constraint? Identify them all, strip them, solution, and then come back into it, back into it. Yes. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
On behalf of our members, I would like to thank